Councillor Draven of the Draelith Confederacy was the first to notice, and even he did not understand what he was looking at right away. He was reviewing a routine trade report when he saw the numbers. The Tenari Corridor, one of the busiest freight lanes in the sector, had reported a 60% drop in cargo volume over the past 5 days. 60%. That kind of number did not happen unless there was a war or a natural disaster, and there was neither. He sent a message to the Corridor Authority asking for an explanation. The response came back 2 hours later, and it was only one sentence long. Human-operated haulers have ceased all operations in the corridor. Draven read the sentence twice. Then he pulled up the corridor's operational records and began going through them carefully. Of the 312 regular freight runs through the Tenari Corridor, 187 were operated by human crews. They carried Tylium ore to Draelith factory worlds. They moved medical supplies to fringe colonies. They transported construction materials for joint infrastructure projects. They had been doing this work for decades, so reliably and so quietly that no one had ever stopped to count how much of the system depended on them. Now they were gone, and the system was breaking. It was not just the Tenari Corridor. Reports started coming in from across Council space within the first week. Communication relay stations that humans had been maintaining went offline one by one. Deep space navigation beacons that human technicians had serviced on regular schedules began to drift out of alignment. A food distribution hub on the fringe world of Kesara, which had been managed by a team of 6 human volunteers, shut down when no one arrived to replace them. The local population, mostly Urani workers and their families, had never thought to ask who kept the hub running. They had simply assumed it would always be there. On Valith Station itself, the effects were slower, but no less real. Dean Morris had been gone for 10 days when the first warning light appeared on the atmospheric recycling control panel. A filter assembly in the eastern quarter was losing efficiency. Under normal circumstances, Dean would have caught it during his weekly inspection, adjusted the flow rates, and replaced the worn components before anyone even noticed a problem. The station's maintenance department, staffed entirely by Veilshi technicians, who had never paid much attention to the recycling systems because a human had always handled them, looked at the warning and was not sure what it meant. They filed a report. The report went to a supervisor. The supervisor forwarded it to the engineering office. The engineering office scheduled a review for the following week. The filter assembly failed 3 days before the review was scheduled. Air quality in the eastern quarter dropped to dangerous levels within hours. 1,200 residents, mostly Draelith and Urani families, had to be evacuated to other sections of the station. It took 2 weeks, and a team of engineers borrowed from a Draelith shipyard to get the system running again. The repair cost more than Dean Morris's entire salary for the last 5 years combined. And Dean had left a maintenance guide. He had placed it on the desk of the station's chief technician, with a note explaining every system, every schedule, every potential failure point. The guide was still sitting on that desk, unopened, when the filter failed. On the council floor, the mood shifted from confusion to alarm. Councillor Ilithra of the Veilshi Dominion, who chaired the security committee, demanded a formal explanation for humanity's withdrawal. She was a tall and elegant being with silver-white skin and a voice that carried authority the way a river carries stones. She had never liked the humans. She had never disliked them either. She had simply never thought about them very much, which was perhaps the worst thing of all. The Diplomatic Records Office retrieved Sam Hartley's datapad and read his final message to the full council. "We tried. You did not. Goodbye." The words hung in the chamber like smoke. A few looked at the empty seats in the back row where the human delegation had once sat. The Urani Collective, acting through their hive speaker, proposed an immediate response. They wanted to send a formal summons to Earth, demanding that humanity explain its actions and return to its obligations. The language of the proposal was sharp. It spoke of duties and commitments and the expectations of membership. It did not contain the word please. The motion passed without opposition. No one voted against it, because no one wanted to appear weak. The summons was transmitted to Earth through the fastest diplomatic channel available. 3 days passed. Then Earth responded. The message was calm and measured, as if it had been written by someone who had anticipated this exact moment. It stated, clearly and without emotion, that humanity's membership in the Galactic Union had always been voluntary, and that all obligations under the Charter had been fulfilled. It wished the Council well, and that was all. There was no anger in the message, no bitterness, no demand for apology or recognition. It was the kind of message a person writes when they'd have already made peace with their decision and have no interest in arguing about it. Counselor Illithra read the response aloud to the council and then stood in silence for a long moment. She was not used to being told no. None of them were. The council had governed this region of space for centuries, and in all that time, no member species had ever simply walked away. There had been conflicts, yes, wars even, but those were loud and dramatic and could be addressed with force or negotiation. This was silence, and silence was much harder to fight. The Draelith began arguing with the Urani about who was responsible. The Urani insisted they had done nothing wrong. The smaller species, the ones who had always stayed quiet during council sessions, began whispering among themselves. Some of them had worked closely with humans on joint projects. Some of them had benefited from human medical programs and engineering support. They had never spoken up before, because speaking up in the council meant drawing attention, and drawing attention meant becoming a target. But now, with the humans gone, and the systems failing, and the blame flying in every direction, some of them were beginning to wonder if staying quiet had been the right choice. On the fringe world of Tassalar 7, a small clinic that had served the local population for 12 years sat dark and empty. Katie Webb had left 6 months of medical supplies stacked neatly in the storage room, each box labeled with clear instructions. She had trained 3 local volunteers to handle basic care. She had done everything she could to make the transition smooth. But no one came to replace her. The Council's medical directorate classified Tassalar 7 as a low-priority world. The supplies ran out. The volunteers did their best, but they were not doctors. Within months, people who could have been saved were not saved. Children who would have lived did not live. No one on the council floor mentioned Tassalar 7. It was a small world, far from the centers of power, and the people who lived there did not have a vote. But the silence from that small world was the loudest sound in the galaxy, if anyone had been willing to hear it. 3 months after the departure, the Galactic Union Council commissioned a report. They called it the Assessment of Operational Gaps, which was a polite way of saying they wanted to know exactly how badly they had underestimated humanity. The report was assigned to a mid-level Veilshi analyst named Torin, a careful and detail-oriented being who had spent most of his career buried in data and had never once spoken on the council floor. He was chosen precisely because he had no political agenda. He was just good with numbers. It took Torin 6 weeks to compile the report. When he finished, he sat at his desk and stared at it for a long time before submitting it. The numbers were not just bad, they were embarrassing. Humanity had been involved in over 400 active programs across Council space at the time of their withdrawal. Not leading them, in most cases, just involved. Filling roles that no one else wanted, running systems that no one else understood. Showing up to places that no one else cared about. The number was so high because humans had a habit of saying yes when asked for help, and then quietly expanding their involvement, until they were holding things together that would collapse without them. The Tenari Corridor was only the most visible example. Across the trade network, human-operated ships had been responsible for 43% of all freight movement. Not because they controlled the trade routes, but because they were willing to fly the long hauls, the dangerous routes, the low-profit runs that other species considered beneath them. Nora Keene had personally managed the scheduling for over 100 of those runs. She knew every captain by name. She knew which ships needed maintenance, and which relay stations had unreliable power supplies. When she left, she handed over everything. Every schedule, every contact, every note. The Drelith Corridor Authority had accepted her files and then never opened them, because they assumed the system would continue to run on its own. It did not. In the science sector, the picture was similar. Human researchers had been contributing to 31 joint research programs, most of them in fields that the Urani Collective considered secondary: agricultural science, water purification, disease prevention on fringe worlds. The kind of work that did not win awards or attract funding, but kept millions of people alive. When the Urani had repeatedly blocked human access to shared databases, those researchers had found workarounds, sourcing their own data, building their own models, sharing results through informal networks. They had kept working not because the Council supported them, but in spite of the fact that it did not. Dr. Katie Webb's clinic on Tasselhoff 7 was part of a larger network of 12 human-run medical outposts on fringe worlds. Each one had been established independently, funded through a mix of small government grants and private donations from people back on Earth who had never seen the worlds they were helping. The doctors and nurses who staffed these clinics were volunteers. They worked long hours in difficult conditions, far from home, treating species whose biology they had to learn on the job. They did it because it needed to be done, and because no one else was doing it. When the clinics closed, the impact was not immediate. It built slowly, like water rising behind a dam. Infant mortality rates climbed. Treatable diseases spread. Populations that had been stable for years began to decline. The Council's Health Directorate eventually noticed the trend, but by then the damage had been compounding for months. Commander Ethan Cole's search and rescue unit in the Black Drift Expanse told a different kind of story. The Black Drift was a region of space that most species avoided if they could. Unstable gravity wells, shifting debris fields, and unpredictable radiation bursts made it one of the most dangerous areas in the sector. But 3 major shipping lanes passed through it, because going around would add weeks to transit times, and so ships went through. And sometimes, those ships got into trouble. Cole had run the rescue unit for 10 years. His team was mixed species, but the core of it had always been human. 12 pilots, 6 medics, and 4 engineers who lived on a converted freighter called the Steady Hand. They did not wait for distress calls. They patrolled. They mapped the gravity wells in real time, updated navigation charts, warned incoming ships about hazards, and when something went wrong, they were usually on scene within hours instead of days. Over a decade, Cole's team had pulled more than 9,000 people out of the Black Drift alive. It was a number that should have been carved into the wall of the Grand Forum. But it was not, because rescue operations in a dangerous backwater did not interest the people who decided what got carved into walls. After the withdrawal, the Council replaced the unit with an automated drone system. The drones were fast and efficient in calm conditions. But the Black Drift was never calm. The drones could not read the subtle shifts in a gravity well the way Cole's pilots could. They could not improvise. They could not make the split-second judgment call that meant the difference between a safe extraction and a catastrophe. Within 3 months, 2 passenger liners were lost. Over 800 people died. When the news reached the Council, Councillor Illithra was the one who had to address the chamber. She stood at the podium and reported the losses in the flat official language that diplomats use when they do not want to feel what they are saying. But her hands were not steady. and those who knew her well could see that something behind her silver eyes had changed. Meanwhile, on Earth, and in the new colonies humanity was building in unclaimed space, life went on. There were no celebrations, no speeches about how the galaxy was learning its lesson. Humanity had not left to teach anyone a lesson. They had left because staying had become an act of self-harm, a slow erosion of dignity that no amount of patience could justify. Laura Finch, the communications engineer who had spent years watching the Council ignore her proposals for relay system upgrades, was now leading the construction of an independent human communications network. It was ambitious work, spanning dozens of star systems, and it was moving fast because Laura no longer had to submit her designs to a committee that would shelve them. She had a team of 40 engineers, most of them people who had worked in council space and come home carrying the same quiet exhaustion that Megan Holt had carried in her eyes that evening, in Sam's office. They did not talk much about the council. There was no bitterness in their silence, just the focused energy of people who had finally been allowed to build something without asking permission. Sam Hartley had returned to a small office in Geneva, where he served as an advisor to the new Office of External Affairs. It was a modest role, and he preferred it that way. He spent his mornings reviewing reports from the new colonies, and his afternoons answering questions from younger diplomats who wanted to understand what had happened and why. One afternoon, a young man named Greg Lawson sat across from him and asked, "Do you think they will come to us eventually?" Sam looked out the window at the gray sky over Geneva. He thought about the ledger, about all those years of careful documentation, about the hope he had carried into every session, and the slow death of that hope over a decade of being ignored. "I think," he said quietly, "that it depends on how much it hurts." Greg frowned. "That sounds harsh." Sam shook his head. "It is not harsh. It is just honest. People do not change because you ask them to. They change because the cost of staying the same becomes too high. We could not make them listen by talking, but silence has a weight of its own." He turned back to his desk and picked up the next report. Outside, the stars were doing what they had always done, burning steadily in the dark, indifferent to the politics of the small creatures who lived between them. But somewhere out there, in council chambers and on struggling worlds, and in the wreckage of systems that used to work, the weight of that silence was growing heavier by the day. 9 months after humanity walked away, the Grand Forum on Valith Station looked nothing like it once had. The chamber that had run with smooth efficiency for centuries was now a place of raised voices, pointed fingers, and long silences filled with resentment. The 46 remaining species were turning on each other, and the cracks were spreading faster than anyone could repair them. The Dralith Confederacy was in the worst shape. Their industrial worlds depended on a steady flow of raw materials, and the supply lines that humans had quietly maintained for decades were now broken or clogged with delays. 3 of their core worlds were experiencing shortages of tylium ore, the base material for nearly all Dralith manufacturing. Factories were slowing down, workers were being sent home. On the streets of Dralith cities, people who had never thought about where their goods came from were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about why the shelves were empty. Councillor Draven had aged visibly in those 9 months. He had always been a confident speaker, the kind of politician who could fill a room with his voice and make everyone in it feel like he was in control. But confidence is easy when things are going well. Now things were not going well, and Draven was spending most of his time deflecting blame and trying to hold his coalition together. He blamed the Urani. It was an easy target. The Urani Collective had been the most openly dismissive of humanity's contributions, particularly in the sciences. Their hive speaker had once referred to human research as the scratching of children in the sand, a remark that had been recorded in the official proceedings and that someone had recently circulated on the public information networks. The Urani, did not appreciate being reminded of it. The Irani, in turn, blamed the Veilshi. It was Councillor Ilithra who had denied humanity patrol rights in the border sectors. It was the Security Committee that had left human colonies exposed to pirate raids for years. The Irani argued that if the Veilshi had shown even basic fairness, the humans might have stayed. The Veilshi blamed everyone. They blamed the smaller species for not speaking up. They blamed the administrative bureaucracy for losing human proposals in committee. They blamed the Trade Commission, which the Draelith controlled, for driving humans out of the economic system with unfair tariffs. The blame traveled in circles, touching everyone, and solving nothing. In the middle of all this, a junior diplomat from the Draelith delegation was doing something that none of the senior counselors had thought to do. She was reading. Solara was young by Draelith standards, barely into her second century. She had been assigned to the council delegation as a low-level attaché, the kind of role that involved carrying documents and refilling water glasses. She had no authority and no influence. What she had was curiosity, and curiosity took her to a place that power had not thought to look. She had met Sam Hartley once, years ago, during a late session that had dragged past midnight. Most of the delegates had gone home, and only a handful of staff remained in the forum's side corridors. Solara had been waiting for her supervisor, and Sam had been sitting on a bench outside his office, drinking something warm from a small cup. He had noticed her standing there, and offered her a smile. They had talked for a few minutes about nothing important. The temperature on the station, the quality of the food in the commissary, the way the lights in the forum flickered during power surges. It was the most ordinary conversation, and it had stayed with her for years, not because of what was said, but because of how it felt. Sam had talked to her the way one person talks to another. Not as a senior diplomat addressing a junior attaché, not as a human addressing a Draelith. Just two tired people at the end of a long day, sharing a moment of simple kindness. When she heard that Sam had left a datapad behind, she went looking for it. It took her 2 days to find it. It had been moved from his office to a storage room, catalogued as a minor item of no significance. She retrieved it, powered it on, and began to read. She had anticipated a list of grievances, angry and emotional. The kind of document a frustrated diplomat might write to make themselves feel better. What she found instead was something far more devastating. It was calm. It was precise. It was organized by year, by category, by species. Every denied proposal was listed with its date, its subject, and the name of the counselor or committee that had rejected it. Every unfair tariff was documented with the exact figures, showing how much more humans were being charged. Every blocked research request, every ignored security appeal, every dismissive remark made on the council floor was recorded with the quiet accuracy of someone who had never stopped believing that the truth mattered, even when no one was listening. Solara read for hours. When she finished, she sat very still and felt something she had not felt before. It was not guilt exactly. It was the uncomfortable recognition that she had been part of a system that had done great harm to people who had done nothing but help, and that she had never questioned it because she had never been asked to. She brought the ledger to the council. It was not easy. Her supervisor told her it was inappropriate. A senior Draelith diplomat warned her that it could embarrass the Confederacy. She did it anyway, filing a formal request to address the full council under the rarely used provision that allowed any delegate, regardless of rank, to present evidence of systemic misconduct. The chamber was full when Solara stood at the podium. She was small for a Draelith, and she had never spoken to an audience of this size. Her voice trembled slightly at the beginning, but it steadied as she went on. She read from the ledger. She did not editorialize. She did not add her own opinions or interpretations. She simply read the entries, one after another, in chronological order. The denied proposals, the excessive tariffs, the blocked research, the ignored warnings about pirate activity near human colonies, the 6 separate occasions on which humanity had requested basic patrol rights and been refused by the Security Committee, the 11 times human medical programs had applied for shared funding and been told the budget was fully allocated, while other programs with less impact received twice the resources. It took 4 hours. By the end, the chamber was silent. Not the restless silence of boredom, which was common in council sessions, but the heavy silence of a room full of people who were being forced to look at something they had spent decades avoiding. Councillor Ilithra was the first to speak afterward. She stood slowly, and for a moment she looked like she was carrying something very heavy on her shoulders. She said, "We were warned, repeatedly, politely, and we chose not to listen." No one argued with her. No one tried to deflect or minimize. The evidence was too clear and too complete for that. A motion was raised to send a delegation to Earth. Not a summons this time, not a demand, an invitation, a request to talk, with the understanding that humanity had every right to say no. The Urani resisted. Their hive speaker argued that sending a delegation would set a dangerous precedent, that it would tell other member species they could leave whenever they were unhappy and expect the council to come begging. The argument had some logic to it, but it rang hollow in a chamber that was still echoing with the sound of Sam Hartley's careful, patient record-keeping. The vote was close. 26 in favor, 20 against. The motion passed. Silara was chosen to lead the delegation. It was an unusual choice, a junior diplomat with no significant rank. But that was exactly the point. The council did not need to send someone powerful. They needed to send someone honest. And after her 4 hours at the podium, reading the truth that no one else had been willing to touch, Silara had earned something that no title or rank could provide. She had earned the right to try. She spent a week preparing for the journey. She studied everything she could find about Earth, about human customs, about the way they communicated and what they valued. She read Sam Hartley's file from beginning to end. She read about Dean Morris and his maintenance guides that no one opened. She read about Dr. Katie Webb and the clinic on Tassalar 7. She read about Commander Ethan Cole and the 9,000 lives he had saved in the Black Drift. And when she boarded the ship that would carry her to the human homeworld, she carried with her no demands, no conditions, and no expectations. She carried only the ledger and the simple, terrifying hope that it was not too late. Silara's ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel on the edge of the Sol system on a Tuesday morning, Earth time. She had been told that humans organized their days into cycles of 7, with names for each one, and that Tuesday was considered unremarkable. She was not sure whether the timing was intentional or coincidental. With humans, she was learning, it was sometimes hard to tell. A single shuttle rose from the surface to meet her. It was small and plain, painted a flat gray, with no markings except a registration number on the hull. The pilot introduced himself as Greg Lawson, a liaison from the Office of External Affairs. He was a young man with light brown hair and an easy smile that did not seem forced. He shook her hand, which she had read was a human greeting that signaled respect and openness, and offered her tea during the ride down. The tea was warm and slightly bitter, and Silara held the cup carefully in both hands as the shuttle descended through layers of white cloud. Below, the planet spread out in shades of blue and green that were more vivid than any image she had seen in council databases. She had expected something austere, maybe, a fortress world, a civilization that had turned inward and hardened itself. But what she saw from the shuttle window was a world that looked very much alive, full of movement and color, and the ordinary business of millions of people going about their day. Greg made small talk during the descent. He told her about the weather in Geneva, which was mild for the season. He pointed out a lake that glittered in the distance. He did not ask about the council or the reason for her visit. He simply made her feel welcome. And Solara thought of Sam Hartley sitting on that bench years ago, offering her a smile and a few minutes of ordinary conversation. The meetings were held in a modest building in Geneva's diplomatic quarter. It was not the kind of building that demanded attention. No towering walls or grand entrances. Just a clean, well-maintained structure with wide windows that let in the afternoon light. Solara was escorted to a conference room on the second floor, where 5 people were waiting at a plain table. Sam Hartley sat in the center. He looked older than she remembered, but his eyes were the same, calm and steady, with a patience that no longer seemed like weakness. To his left was Megan Holt, who now carried the title of Acting Director of External Relations. She was poised and alert, and she watched Solara with the careful attention of someone who had spent years studying people who did not say what they meant. To Sam's right were 3 others. Ethan Cole, the former commander of the Black Drift Rescue Unit, whose presence signaled that security would be discussed. Nora Keene, who would handle trade and logistics. And Diana Pratt, a constitutional scholar, who would address the legal framework of whatever came next. There were no banners in the room, no flags, no display of power or authority. Just 5 people at a table, waiting to hear what she had come to say. Solara set the ledger on the table. She saw Sam's eyes move to it, and then back to her face, and she thought she saw something shift in his expression. Something too quick and too private to name. She spoke for nearly an hour. She told them what had happened in the council since their departure. She described the shortages and the failures and the arguments and the blame. She did not soften it or frame it in diplomatic language. She told the truth, plainly and completely, because she had come to understand that these were people who valued honesty above almost everything else. Then she told them about the reading of the ledger. She described the silence in the chamber afterward. She repeated Ilithra's words, and she said without embellishment that the council had sent her to ask what it would take for humanity to come back. When she finished, the room was quiet. Megan Holt made a small note on her datapad. Ethan Cole leaned back in his chair with his arms folded, his face unreadable. Nora Keene studied the table. Diana Pratt watched Sam. Sam Hartley looked at Solara for a long moment. His expression was not cold or angry. It was the expression of a man who had thought about this moment for a very long time, and had already made his peace with what he was going to say. "We are not coming back," he said. The words landed gently, but they landed hard. She had prepared herself for this possibility, but hearing it was different from imagining it. Sam continued. His voice was even, almost kind. "We spent 60 years earning a seat we were never given. We filed every form. We followed every rule. We showed up for every session and sat in the back and raised our hands and waited to be called on. And in 60 years, the answer was always the same. Not now. Not yet. Maybe later." He paused. "We are done with maybe later." Solara opened her mouth to respond, but Sam held up a hand, not to silence her, but to ask for a moment more. "But we are not your enemies," he said. "We never were. We did not leave to punish you. We left because staying was costing us something we could not afford to lose. Our dignity, our sense of purpose, the belief that our work mattered." He looked down at the ledger on the table. It did matter. But we cannot keep giving to people who do not see the gift. Solara nodded slowly. She understood. She did not like it, but she understood. "Then what would you accept?" she asked. Megan Holt answered. She slid a document across the table, a thick stack of pages, neatly bound and clearly organized. "We prepared this a long time ago," she said. "Years before the departure. It was meant to be a reform proposal for the council. We never submitted it because we knew it would be buried in committee like everything else. But the work is sound." The document outlined a new framework, not membership, not a return to the old system. Instead, it proposed a parallel structure of bilateral partnerships between humanity and individual council species. Each partnership would focus on specific areas of cooperation: trade, research, emergency response, infrastructure. Each agreement would be negotiated directly, with clear terms, transparent accountability, and regular reviews. Either side could walk away at any time if the terms were not being met. It was not a demand. It was an offer. The difference mattered. Sylara picked up the document and turned through its pages slowly. The detail was extraordinary. Every section addressed a specific area where humanity had previously contributed. Trade logistics included Nora Keene's corridor schedules and proposed training programs so that other species could manage the routes themselves. Medical outreach included plans for joint clinics, where human doctors would work alongside local practitioners, building capacity instead of dependence. The security section, drafted with input from Ethan Cole, proposed shared patrol units in the Black Drift and other dangerous regions, with command rotating between human and alien officers on equal terms. Diana Pratt explained the legal structure. No species would be subordinate to another. Every agreement would be between equals. If a dispute arose, it would be resolved through an independent panel, not by the Council, which had proven it could not be trusted to treat all parties fairly. Solara looked up from the document and met Sam's eyes. "You had this ready?" "For years," he said. "Then why did you never share it?" Sam smiled, and there was something in that smile that was both sad and warm. "Because we were waiting for someone to ask. Not to demand, not to summon, just to ask." Solara took the document back to the Council. The debate lasted months. Some species accepted the framework immediately. The smaller nations, the ones who had quietly benefited from human help and quietly mourned its loss, were the first to sign bilateral agreements. The Draelith came next, driven by economic necessity, and perhaps by something more than necessity. Councillor Draven signed the trade partnership himself, and those who watched him said he looked like a man setting down a weight he had been carrying for too long. The Orani resisted the longest. Their hive speaker argued that the framework undermined the Council's authority. But one by one, the Orani's own scientists, the ones who had worked alongside human researchers in the informal networks that the collective had never acknowledged, began advocating for change. They had seen what humans could do when they were allowed to work freely, and they wanted that partnership back. The Veilshi were the last to sign. Councillor Ilfra brought the agreement before her security committee and argued for it personally. She did not make excuses for what had been done in the past. She simply said that the cost of pride was too high and that the Council could not afford to pay it any longer. On the day the last agreement was signed, there was no ceremony, no grand moment of reconciliation. Sam Hartley was in his office in Geneva, reading a report about a new colony being established in the Varen system. Megan Holt sent him a message with the news. He read it, nodded to himself, and went back to work. Somewhere on the far side of the galaxy, a new relay station came online, built by Laura Finch's team, connecting human space to the wider network for the first time, through a channel that humanity controlled. Somewhere in the Black Drift, a joint patrol unit began its first sweep, with Ethan Cole advising from a distance. Somewhere on Tassalar 7, a new clinic opened its doors, staffed by a human doctor and 2 local volunteers who had been trained by Katie Webb years ago and had never stopped hoping she would come back. She did not come back, but she sent others, and the work continued. Humanity had not asked for gratitude. They had not demanded an apology. They had not sought revenge, or tried to humiliate the species that had humiliated them. They had simply stood where they were, and said clearly and without anger, that respect was not something you gave to the powerful because they were powerful. It was something you owed to anyone who showed up and did the work. The galaxy was slow to learn that lesson. But it learned. Quietly, imperfectly, one agreement at a time, it learned. And in the silence that humanity had left behind, the species of the Galactic Union finally heard what had been there all along. The steady, patient heartbeat of people who had never stopped caring, even when no one cared about them. Sam Hartley had been sitting in the back row of the Grand Forum for 11 years. He knew every scratch on the surface of his desk. He knew the exact moment the overhead lights would dim during the afternoon session. He knew which delegates would speak and which would pretend to listen. He knew all of this because very little ever changed for the human delegation on Valith Station. The Galactic Union Council was made up of 47 species. Some were ancient civilizations that had been traveling between stars for thousands of years before humanity ever left Earth. Others were newer, like the humans, but had found their way into powerful positions through trade, military strength, or simply being in the right place at the right time. Humanity had none of those advantages. They had arrived on the galactic stage 62 years ago, eager and optimistic, and they had been politely ignored ever since. Sam was not a dramatic man. He came from a small town in Virginia, where people said good morning to strangers and held doors open without thinking about it. He had joined the diplomatic service because he believed in talking things through. He believed that patience and good faith could open any door. That belief had carried him through 6 years of training, 2 years of junior postings on border stations, and then 11 years as the senior ambassador to the council. And in all that time, not once had the council given humanity a fair hearing. It was not that they were cruel about it. That was the part most people misunderstood. The Dralith Confederacy did not stand up and say they hated humans. The Urani Collective did not publish statements calling humanity inferior. The Velshi Dominion did not threaten them. What they did was far more effective. They simply treated humans as if they were not quite there. Proposals were acknowledged and then buried in committees that never met. Requests were forwarded to offices that had no authority. Complaints were filed into systems designed to lose them. Sam kept records of all of it. He called the file the ledger. It was not a secret. Anyone on his staff could access it. His aide, Megan Holt, had helped him organize it over the years. She was younger than him, sharper in some ways, and far less patient. She had come to Valith straight out of the diplomatic academy with fire in her eyes, and the council had spent 5 years slowly putting that fire out. One evening, after a session in which the council had voted to table a human proposal on shared medical research for the 4th time in 2 years, Megan sat across from Sam in his office and said, "They are never going to listen to us." Sam looked up from the datapad he was reading. He studied her face for a moment. She was not angry. That was what struck him. She was not frustrated or bitter, the kind of tired that comes from pushing against a wall that will never move. "No," he said. "I do not think they are." "Then why are we still here?" It was a simple question. Sam had asked it to himself many times over the years. He had always found a reason to stay. Maybe the next session would be different. Maybe a new counselor would take an interest. Maybe the Dralith Trade Commission would finally review the tariff complaint he had filed 3 years ago. There was always a maybe. But that night, sitting in his small office on a station that had never felt like home, Sam Hartley ran out of maybes. He did not make a scene. He did not call a press conference or send an angry message to the council chair. Instead, he opened a secure channel to Earth and spoke quietly with the people who needed to know. The conversations were brief and businesslike. Everyone on the other end had been expecting this call for a long time. Over the next 48 hours, the human delegation on Valith Station packed up. They did it calmly and without rush. They took down the flag that had hung in the ambassador's office since the first human envoy had arrived on the station. They collected personal items, archived digital files, and cleaned their workspaces. Dean Morris, the lead engineer who maintained the station's atmospheric recycling systems, left a detailed maintenance guide on the desk of the station authority's chief technician. Nora Keene, who ran logistics for the Tenari Trade Corridor, sent a final status report to the corridor relay stations with notes on every pending shipment and every scheduled maintenance window. No one on the station noticed, or if they did, they assumed it was routine. Humans were always busy with something, always moving, always working. It was easy to overlook them because they never demanded attention. On the last morning, Sam Hartley stood alone in his office. The room was bare. The shelves were empty. The desk was clean except for a single datapad placed neatly in the center. He had thought about what to write on it for a long time. He had drafted long letters, detailed explanations, carefully worded arguments, laying out everything the Council had done wrong, and everything humanity had tried to do right. In the end, he deleted all of it. He typed one line. "We tried. You did not. Goodbye." He set the datapad down, picked up his bag, and walked out of the office for the last time. Megan was waiting for him at the transport dock. The rest of the delegation was already aboard. She looked at him with a question on her face, and he answered it with a small nod. "That is it then," she said. "That is it." The transport ship undocked from Valith Station at 6 in the morning, local time. It joined a quiet stream of human vessels that were pulling away from stations, outposts, and colony support centers all across Council-affiliated space. There were no announcements, no farewell broadcasts, no threats or ultimatums. Humanity simply gathered its people, packed its things, and left. Back on Valith, the Council held its regular session that afternoon. The human seats in the back row were empty, but no one commented on it. The Dralith Trade Commissioner gave a long speech about tariff adjustments. The Urani Science Directorate presented a proposal for a new deep space telescope. The Vale-Shi Security Chair reviewed patrol schedules for the outer sectors. Everything proceeded as normal. It would be 3 more days before anyone on the Council realized that humanity was gone. Not just from the station, not just from the forum, from everywhere. Every outpost, every trade lane, every medical clinic, every engineering project, every rescue operation, every relay station that human hands had built and maintained. All of it silent. And in that silence, for the first time in 62 years, the galaxy began to hear what it had been refusing to listen to all along.